It's early on Monday morning, the 3rd of August 1987, and at the foothills of the French Alps, 19-year-old Trevor O'Keeffe jumps out of a car. He stands at the edge of the motorway that leads to Paris. Beyond the road are rolling green fields and vineyards, laden down with grapes soon to be harvested and transformed into champagne. Trevor has spent the summer on a working holiday in France. He is starting on the journey back to Kildare to see his family. He has called his sister Tootsie and told her that he's heading for home. He asks her not to tell their mother Arlene. He wants to keep his return a surprise. A friend offers him money for a train fare, but Trevor refuses. He would rather hitchhike. For Trevor, that's part of the adventure. As he stands at the side of the motorway, he has a 400-kilometre journey ahead of him. In Trevor's pocket is a list of the towns he needs to travel through to get to the port in Calais. Dijon, Rheims, Saint-Quentin. Lots more adventure before landing back in Ireland. What Trevor doesn't know is that throughout this region of France, young men have been warned against hitchhiking. Locals talk about rumours that there is a serial killer stalking the area. Already, 6 young men have disappeared. All were said to be hitchhiking at the time. Only one body has ever been found. The police have no leads and are doing their best to quell any panic, dismissing the notion of a serial killer in the mountains of Mourmelon as outlandish. Trevor, unaware of the danger, sticks his thumb out on the road. A van pulls up and Trevor hops in. It would prove to be a fatal mistake. Trevor was never seen alive again. Justice is rarely simple, but when a serious crime happens in another country, everything becomes harder. Different laws, different police forces, a different language. The search for answers about what happened or who committed the crime is made even more difficult. For families trying to find answers, even basic questions can become battles. Who is in charge? What is being investigated? What information can be shared? What happens next? And still asking, who did it? My name is John Sweetman. For 25 years I worked as a detective in the Garda Technical Bureau, trained to read what crime scenes reveal and what they conceal. To look closely at the smallest detail, because those details are often where the truth hides. Welcome to Lines of Enquiry. In this GoLoud original podcast, I follow the evidence step by step, not just to understand what happened, but to understand how investigations unfold, and sometimes how they fail. If you are hearing us for the first time, I would encourage you to go back and start at Season 1, Episode 1. In this episode, we leave Ireland and travel to France, where a serial killer has been murdering and abusing young men, picked up as they hitchhike along roads. Where a young Irishman, Trevor O'Keeffe, has just begun a journey home. This is the story of what happens when justice is an ocean away. Trevor O'Keeffe grew up in the town of Naas, County Kildare, the 4th of 5 children in a close-knit family. He was 19 years old in the summer of 1987, a handsome young fellow with a cheeky grin, the kind of young man who could charm anyone. Friends and family remembered Trevor as lively and outgoing, the lovable scamp of the family. He had inherited his mother Arlene's bright smile and sense of adventure. Growing up with 4 siblings, Trevor learned independence early. His mother encouraged it, teaching the kids to drive on Curracloe Beach in Wexford in her old Mini Cooper, letting little Trevor sit on a cushion so he could reach the wheel at the age of 10. The O'Keeffes didn't have much money, like a lot of families in Ireland at the time, but they had fun and adventure. They cared for each other and forged deep links with their neighbours. They had a mobile home down in Wexford, and every Friday, Arlene would pack the kids into the little Mini, and off they'd set on the 2-hour drive to the sunny southeast. Those early years created a tight family bond, one that would prove crucial in the challenges to come. By 1987, Trevor had finished secondary school and was eager to see the world. That summer, he had his first experience of living away from home. He had gone to England, where he settled in St. Albans and worked in a bar. It was at that bar that Trevor met a French chap named Christian Jallet. He came from the Poligny region of France, a small market town in the Jura area of eastern France, set below limestone plateaus surrounded by vineyards, forests and rural landscapes. It is known locally as the capital of Comté, with deep traditions of cheese-making and wine, and home to a community of roughly 4,000 people at the time. With Christian making plans to return home, his new pal Trevor decided to go with him on a whim. He planned to make it a backpacking trip, a short holiday before returning home to start the next chapter of his life. In early August, he waved goodbye to his family, a rucksack on his back, wearing new jeans and a shirt he got for his travels. His mother, Erilene, insisted on snapping a photo of him that day, in his camping gear and knitted cap, eyes lit up with excitement. She said jokingly, "You're going to be some heartbreaker someday." He was as happy as Larry, she later recalled, of that last parting. The next morning, Trevor was up at the crack of dawn, eager to get going. He had breakfast with his mam and younger brother William. At 5.5 years old, William idolised his older, cool brother, heading away for adventure and fun in France. With his new clothes, rucksack packed, Trevor also had used his bar wages to treat himself to a new Walkman. As he picked his tapes for the trip, his mam Erilene looked at him with the long, proud glance mothers do. Seeing his mother well up with pride, Trevor joked, "Stop looking at me like I'm a kid, ma'am. I'm a man now, and a man's got to do what a man's got to do." They both laughed. Trevor himself was in the Army Reserves, and his ambitions to join the British Army had caused arguments between him and his mother. Erilene couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to him. She hoped after his time away travelling, he might return home open to other suggestions for his future. Trevor set out for Dublin Airport. That would be the last time Erilene would see her son alive. Trevor's plan was simple: travel a bit in France, then hitchhike back to Ireland. He was on a budget, and hitchhiking was common among young adventurers in the 80s. His mother had always told her kids that if they ever had to hitch a lift, it was safest to trust someone in uniform, a postman, a police officer, maybe even a soldier. Those words, meant to reassure and offer security, would come back to haunt her. On August 8, Trevor made his way north through France. At one point, a friend drove Trevor to the motorway in the Marne region to help him along. From there, Trevor stood by the road with his thumb out, just another hitchhiker looking for a lift. The cars and lorries roared past on a warm summer afternoon. Finally, a car slows to a stop. Behind the wheel is a man wearing a military uniform, a French army officer offering the young Irishman a lift. Trevor, likely recalling his mother's advice, trusts a man in uniform, climbs in with relief. He has no way of knowing that he has just stepped into unimaginable danger. "5 days later, Trevor still hadn't called home. His family was not yet alarmed. This is the era before mobile phones. A few days of radio silence wasn't unusual for a traveller. But what they couldn't have known was that Trevor O'Keeffe had vanished somewhere along his route. At 8:30 p.m. on Saturday the 8th of August 1987, avid hunter Michel Lant was walking through a quiet woods near Saint-Quentin in the northeast of France with his dog and his gun by his side. The dog veered off the path down a freshly made trail of broken branches and flattened nettles. Michel followed his dog down the sloping ground to the hollow of an old bomb crater. There, he noticed a mound of disturbed dirt. He thought maybe somebody had buried an animal. He broke off a branch from one of the trees and brushed away some of the loose soil. A hand appeared. It was a man's body laying in a shallow grave. His skin was colourless, his neck bearing dark bruises. He had brown hair and was wearing a blue shirt, jeans, light blue underpants and black socks. There was a rectangular citizen's watch on his wrist. He had been wearing blue suede shoes, but the right shoe was removed and sat on top of his hip. The buttons on his shirt were missing, and his jeans were ripped near the fly. There was an indentation on his middle finger, but no ring. When the police arrived, they could not find any wallet or passport, and there was nothing to tell them who he was. Nothing to say why he was left there. As investigators began searching the area for clues, one thing was clear. This was no accident. Whoever killed him tried to erase his identity, stripping him of ID and possessions. An officer was assigned to sift through the soil and debris. Suddenly, a small rectangle of paper fluttered out of the dead boy's clothing. A business card, creased and dirt-stained, bearing the name Kevin Sweeney. On the back, handwritten, was a telephone number. A week later, on the 15th of August, police in St Albans, London, called the office of Kevin Sweeney. A young Irish girl on his staff, Trevor O'Keeffe, also known as Tootsie, answered the call. They explained that a body had been found and asked her if Kevin or any member of his family had been to France lately. She immediately thought of her younger brother, 19-year-old Trevor, who had gone hitchhiking through France. She had written her number on the back of her boss's business card and given it to Trevor, so he would always have a way of contacting her. Trevor had finished secondary school and was eager to see the world. He had come to London that summer and worked for a time in St Albans in a bar where he made friends with a Frenchman named Christian Jallet. With Christian making plans to return home, Trevor decided to go with him on a whim. He planned to make it a backpacking trip, a short holiday before returning home to start the next chapter of his life. In early August, he waved goodbye to his family, a rucksack on his back full of his new clothes for the trip. The O'Keeffes had lost most of their family photographs in a house fire years earlier, and Trevor often complained that there weren't enough pictures of him. When he'd bought all the gear for his trip, he brought it into the sitting room, saying, "Mum, take a few photographs of me, will you?" His mother, also called Ereline, took a picture of her son. He had packed for every occasion: a dicky bow and grey suit for work, a Nottingham Forest t-shirt and a trendy Hawaiian shirt, and the essentials, new socks and underwear from Marks and Spencer's. After a few short days in France, Trevor had called Tootsie to let her know that he couldn't find any work and had started to make his journey home. He warned her not to tell their mam he was on his way back. He wanted to surprise her. Trevor's plan was simple: travel a bit in France, then hitchhike back to Ireland. Christian's mother drove Trevor to the motorway in the Marne region to help him along. From there, Trevor stood by the road with his thumb out, just another hitchhiker looking for a lift. He was on a budget, and hitchhiking was common among young adventurers in the 80s. Tootsie's birthday had passed on the 12th of August without a phone call from Trevor. Trevor had never forgotten her birthday before. She had a bad feeling. Now, here was a PC Barden from the St Albans police telling Tootsie that French police had found a dead man. A business card was found nearby. Kevin Sweeney's card. The exact type of card Tootsie had given Trevor. Tearfully, Tootsie asked PC Barden for a description of the man who had been found. He told her the body was too badly decomposed to identify, but that it was the body of an old man. Unconvinced and unsure of what to do next, Tootsie rang her mother at home in Ireland. A week after the body was first discovered, Arlene O'Keeffe answered the phone at her home in Naas, County Kildare. Her daughter, Tootsie, was on the other end. She said, "Ma'am, don't worry too much. I think they're wrong," before continuing, "I think Trevor is dead." Arlene O'Keeffe refused to believe it. Her son couldn't be dead in a foreign country, she thought. These things happen to other people's families, not hers. Needing answers, Arlene called the police station. The police officer she spoke to told her, "It's not your son. You're overreacting." They repeated what they had told Tootsie. This was an old man. She needn't to worry. Arlene demanded to know more, asking the sergeant to tell her the area where the body was found, or the number for the station in France so she could speak to them directly. The sergeant avoided answering the question, but Arlene continued asking until eventually he revealed the truth. There was no one in the station who spoke French, he told her. "We can't tell you where it is. We don't know it ourselves." For the first few days after Tootsie's phone call, the O'Keeffe family waited in hope for a phone call from Trevor. Arlene slept on the kitchen floor to make sure that she would hear the phone ring. Desperate for any word from the son she had said goodbye to a few weeks earlier. Perhaps he was on an adventure somewhere. Trevor was a kind, relaxed young man, full of life. Someone who makes friends easily. Someone who trusts people. A handsome young fella with a cheeky grin. The type who could charm anyone. His family thought he would be the first of his 4 siblings to be married. When he was 17, his mother had become suspicious when he started leaving early for school, and one day she followed him to a house on the other side of Naas. A young girl answered the door in her dressing gown. Later that night, Arlene called back to the house to speak to her mother, saying, "Sure, I don't want to become a grandmother just yet, do you?" After 4 days of waiting, of calling the Irish Embassy in Paris and the Department of Foreign Affairs looking for information, the Gardaí called to Arlene's door. They wanted a description of Trevor. She thought back to the photo she'd taken of him before he left, in his camping gear and knitted cap, eyes lit up with excitement. One of the very few she had of her son. Her son, grown into a handsome young man with a dimpled smile people noticed straight away. The kind of smile that makes strangers warm to him, that makes him easy to remember. Arlene described him to the guard, telling them dark with short hair and blue eyes, slim and fit. The next day, Detective Frank McLaughlin called back to the house. "We can't confirm for sure," he told Arlene, "but it could be Trevor." The Irish Embassy and French authorities provided only the barest details. A body was found. She was not told how he died. She assumed it was an accident. Arlene was told she needed to go to France and identify him. She had no money to travel. She didn't even have a passport in 1987. These were the days before budget airlines and multiple flights a day crisscrossing Dublin to Paris and back again. She needed to get on the next possible flight, but she was a single mother working at a hardware shop. In a panic, she racked her brains to think of anyone who might be able to help her. Who would have access to the amount of cash she needed? Who might give her such a loan? Arlene suddenly thought of the milkman, Mick Fitzpatrick. It was a Thursday, so he would be collecting the week's milk money. They had children who were similar ages, and she knew him socially. He was her only hope. She hopped in her car driving around Naas looking for the milkman. She found him on his round nearby. Arlene asked him for £600, explaining to him about the phone call from Tootsie and how she needed to go to France. This body might be Trevor. Without hesitation, Mick agreed. He didn't have enough collected yet, so he told her to meet him in Lacan View, a housing estate in Naas, a few hours later, where he handed over the cash. Within a day of learning the news, Arlene and her older sister Nolene Slattery, who had a daughter living in France, were on their way to Saint-Quentin, France. Trevor's brother, James, would take the boat over from England. San Quentin is a historic old town with medieval roots and Gothic cathedrals. It lays along the banks of the River Somme, and after the First World War, much of the town was rebuilt in the Art Deco style of the 1920s. Arriving in this unfamiliar town in the early hours of the morning, the group headed straight to the police station. In the dark of night, the station looked sinister, looming over the tall railings surrounding it. The gates were locked. The O'Keeffes rang the intercom and were led down a long and dimly lit corridor where they were met by the lead investigator, Captain Alain Scotchila, who spoke no English. A young officer with broken English was enlisted to ask questions. He handed Erilene a photograph, a close-up of a lifeless hand wearing a watch. Erilene recognised it immediately. It was a citizen watch, the one she had given Trevor as a gift. Then they showed her a photograph of Trevor's face, still covered in dirt from the shallow grave in which he'd been found. Erilene wanted to reach out and close his staring eyes. While she knew from the personal items police had shown her and the photos that Trevor was the victim found in the shallow grave, she could not truly accept it without seeing her son. She asked to see Trevor's body. The captain hesitated. Then he told them that Trevor had already been buried the day before they arrived. James jumped up and kicked the wall with rage. Erilene was stunned. They knew she was coming over to identify Trevor. The police had been the ones to book their hotel. Why would they bury him before they arrived? The language barrier made communication difficult, but police gave their best excuses. It was upon the orders of the local magistrate. It's the summer. The weather meant they couldn't delay. The mortuary is not equipped to keep bodies for more than 4 days. Erilene took James into her arms as she tried to calm him down. The police continued. They told the family that Trevor's death had been no accident. He had been murdered. Erilene struggled to accept what she was hearing. Her son had been strangled. That it had been likely motivated by robbery, probably a very quick death. Captain Scotchila promised the group that he would do everything he could to catch Trevor's killer. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Erilene returned to the police station, determined not to leave France without seeing where her son was buried. The police led her to a local cemetery in San Quentin and escorted her along the flower beds lining the edges of the green lawn. They continued down to the very back of the graveyard, the pauper's space, which was bare, nothing but a few sparse poplar trees at the boundary. There were no crosses, no headstones to differentiate between the mucky mounds of earth. No way for the family to know which grave contained the body of Trevor O'Keeffe, save for the policeman who pointed at the fresh earth. In that moment, Erilene decided that this would not be her son's final resting place. In a matter of days, she had gone from selling lawnmowers at her job in Atlantic Home Care in Naas to standing in a foreign graveyard facing into a nightmare made real. And one made even worse by having to somehow navigate foreign laws through another language, just to bring Trevor home after a brutal murder. She tried to see the judge who had ordered his burial, but she was told the judge was too busy to meet her. She called the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs to see if they might help with the cost, only for an amused worker on the other end to ask if she knew how costly it would be to bring every dead body home from abroad. She battled for 6 weeks through a maze of paperwork to have Trevor's body exhumed and flown back to Ireland. Nolene and Erilene went back to France in September to take him home. It was pouring rain when they arrived to the cemetery. 4 or 5 men stood around the grave, but no one spoke to the 2 women. Legally, someone had to witness the exhumation, and despite having agreed that Nolene would be the one to do this, When the men began to use a JCB to lift the soil away, Eirlín turned around to watch with her sister. When it was retrieved from the damp soil, the cheap and flimsy coffin shattered, boards breaking apart. Trevor's body, wrapped in a plastic bag, appeared in the gaps. The smell was appalling, and a flurry of blue bottles surrounded the coffin. Back in Naas, just 2 months after he had set off on his trip, Trevor O'Keeffe was finally laid to rest properly at the Church of Our Lady in St. David's. The church was packed with friends and family, and even some journalists who had heard about Trevor's murder. As she sat in the church pew, and as she watched them fill in the grave, Eirlín was convinced she could still hear the blue bottles buzzing around the coffin. Having buried Trevor, the family now had to begin to cope with their relentless grief. No one could mention Trevor's name without crying. Trying to keep her tears from her family, Eirlín would hide in the wardrobe to cry. One Friday night that October, Eirlín left the family home and began walking up the nearby Kilcullen Road. It was dark out and raining. The drivers beeped at her recklessness as they flew by, unaware that being hit by a car was what she wanted. A squad car pulled up to offer her a lift, but she refused. She walked until she reached the garage a few miles away, before turning around and going home. Eirlín always tried to hide her grief from her children, and did her best to keep the gruesome details of Trevor's case from them too. Although, as time went on and the investigation dried up, there were less and less new details available to any of the O'Keeffes. She had sent them pictures of Trevor to circulate to nearby police stations and the newspapers in the hope that a witness might come forward. One witness who lived near where Trevor's body was found reported having seen a green Volkswagen van in the area around the time he died. Without any French, it was impossible for Eirlín to call the station and ask for an update on the case, but she believed them when they promised her that they would do their best to find her son's killer. In December 1987, 5 months after Trevor's death, a package arrived at the O'Keeffe's home in Naas. There was a French stamp on it. It was addressed to Trevor. With shaking hands, Eirlín considered what to do with the letter. For a mere split second before I read it, she would later write, I had thought, hoped, believed it was from Trevor, telling me everything was okay and he had found a job and was coming home. Instead, she was holding more proof of something else entirely. The letter came from a woman named Joëlle Chorel, living south of St. Quentin where Trevor's body was found. In August that year, Joelle's husband Thierry had been out walking in a forest near their home. He noticed a tent and a camping bag, and scattered all around it the personal papers of Trevor O'Keeffe. The papers included his birth certificate, his Irish Reserve Defence Forces identification, and his list of the various towns he would need to hitchhike through to get home. The couple thought perhaps the bag had been stolen, and phoned their local police station only to be told to hold onto it themselves in case someone came looking for it. And so, for months the rucksack of Trevor O'Keeffe hung on a nail in their garage, until one day Joëlle decided to take matters into her own hands. In her letter, Joëlle wrote, Please can you write to us to tell news of Trevor because we worry about him. Eirlín took the letter to Naas Garda Station and handed it over. The Gardaí forwarded it to the French authorities. Only then would the response change. Police arrived to Joelle's door to take away the backpack and papers. It was the first sign of urgency in months. After discovering what had happened to Trevor, Joëlle wrote again to Eirlín. This time she told her, You must find the person who did this horrible crime. Eirlín O'Keeffe's ordeal was only just beginning. How could she return to normal life knowing her son's killer was unidentified and free? With this new lead, she pushed for answers from French authorities. She encountered indifference and stonewalling. Trevor's case, it seemed, was still not an urgent concern for the local police, with no suspect, no real investigation, and no justice in sight. The O'Keeffes had every reason to despair, but unknown to Eirlín, her son's murder was not an isolated tragedy. Other young men had disappeared in that same corner of France, and somewhere, within those disappearances, was the first clear sign that Trevor's killer was not finished. Trevor O'Keeffe's dream trip ended in horror when his strangled body was found buried in a shallow grave in France. His mother, Eirlín, brought him home to Ireland only to face a French investigation that seemed to go nowhere. She refused to let the case fade. She was racked with guilt, blaming herself for letting him go and for not being there when he needed her most. The questions consumed her. What had happened to him? Was his murderer someone he met on his travels? Did someone follow him from England or from home? The case had attracted the attention of the media both at home and abroad. In Ireland, journalists called to the family's home in Naas asking to see Mrs. O'Keeffe. Eirlín answered the door but pretended that she was the cleaning lady and that Mrs. O'Keeffe wasn't in. She could not admit that her son was dead. She did all she could to hide it and conceal it, even within her own family. When the Irish newspapers reported on his murder, she would visit the different shops around the town, buying multiple copies of the paper to post to her children living abroad, but she could never send them. There were often mistakes in the reporting, such as that he had been found naked. Even when accurate, Eirlín wanted to shield her children from the gory detail. So she kept the papers stuffed in pillowcases and suitcases and at the bottom of wardrobes. She was also beginning to amass a collection of newspaper clippings from her niece, Caroline, in France. While Eirlín had begun to recognise certain words in French, such as victim, autopsy and strangled, she still needed to get the articles translated. This was difficult in Kildare in the 80s, but necessary as the newspapers often offered more insight into the case than what Eirlín was getting from the police. In January 1988, a newspaper cutting arrived that mentioned Trevor's murder and added a terrifying new layer. It said the French authorities were quietly comparing Trevor's death to a series of disappearances stretching back years in the Marne region of France. The area was known locally as the Triangle of Death. Trevor's route home would have seen him passing right through the hunting ground of a possible serial killer. The police had not mentioned anything about a potential serial killer to Eirlín by the summer of 1988. Now a year had passed with no suspects and no discernible progress, but she could not help but wonder if the cases were connected. Another article sent by Caroline mentioned that parents of some of the missing men had set up a group, Les Disparus de Mourmelon, in English, The Disappeared of Mourmelon. They did not accept that their sons had deserted the army and never contacted them again. Eirlín called the Department of Foreign Affairs to ask about the group, but they had no information for her. In France, the police told her the group did not exist. Between January 1980 and September 1982, 5 conscripts went missing. Patrick Dubois, Serge Havel, Manuel Carvalho, Pascal Sargent, and Olivier Donner had disappeared in the area. In August 1988, 1 year after Trevor's murder, Pallas Falvey, a Hungarian student on his holidays in France, was hitchhiking on a motorway outside Paris when a green Volkswagen van passed him. The driver of the van seemed to be alone and was singing to himself. It was around 7 p.m. when Falvey watched the van turn off the road. Hours later, Falvey was still standing on the side of the motorway, trying to make his way south to Lyon, when the green van returned and pulled up beside him. Falvey got into the passenger seat. The driver had a thin face, with a square jaw and sunken cheeks. Falvey noticed he had cold eyes. The driver went slowly along the motorway, whistling away, before turning off onto a smaller road. Falvey noticed that they were no longer heading towards Lyon. They came to a dark and deserted intersection. The driver stopped the car. He seemed nervous. Claiming to be lost, he got into the back of the van searching for a map. They drove on before he stopped again. This time he said he was looking in the back for a pen. And then they stopped again. The driver went to get an apple, which he offered to Falvey. The van stopped again. The driver climbed in behind the passenger seat. Falvey felt a thick strap wrap around his neck and pull his head backwards. He fought to free himself, but the driver pulled the strap so hard he couldn't breathe. The driver forced him into the back of the van, onto a bed, where he chained Falvey so he could not escape. 2 days later, on the 10th of August, 2 gendarmes, French police officers, were on a patrol on a quiet country road to the south of Paris, when they spotted a parked Volkswagen camper van and a man nearby with a shovel. Suspicious, they examined the van. Gendarme Christian Junet peered through a gap in the curtains along the window. Inside he saw a young man, bound, chained and naked. The driver told the police he and the man inside were just having some fun and that it was a consensual encounter. The police were about to leave when Falvey screamed from the back of the van, "Save me, save me." Palas Falvey had endured a 20-hour ordeal of sexual abuse and torture at the hands of the van's driver. He was barely alive when police rescued him. The Hungarian later recounted that he had been sodomized and brutalized. His captor had even filmed parts of the attack on a camcorder. Falvey believed that if the gendarme hadn't chanced upon him when they did, he would have been killed, saying, "He had the look of a madman and I thought, he will kill me. I saw in his eyes the urge to kill." Gendarme Junet noticed the driver's military ID card showed he had been stationed at the base in Mourmelon for 9 years. He thought of the stories of missing army recruits in the area. He called another police officer, Jean-Marie Tarbe. Tarbe had been one of the few to keep interest in the cases of the missing men, even when many others in the police force had not. Junet told him what he had seen and about the man they had arrested, Pierre Chanal. Tarbe had been investigating the disappearances of those 8 missing men in the area for the previous 6 years. On little more than good instinct, he decided to question Chanal not only about Falvey, but about the disappearances in the Triangle of Death. Along with his boss, he interrogated Chanal for 46 hours. They got little from him, as he banged his head on the desk and hit the metal cupboard with his fists. Chanal lay on the floor, absolutely rigid to avoid answering any questions. Investigators compared Chanal to a block of marble as he resisted all attempts to draw information from him. They soon learned he was Pierre Chanal, a 41-year-old sergeant major in the French army. He was a decorated soldier, a former commando who had even received the prestigious Medal for Military Valour in 1985. One of 15 children from a poor family in Saint-Étienne, his father had been an alcoholic. Chanal had reportedly slept in the garden shed growing up, and at a young age left his family home for the army. He was a good soldier, and his colleagues described him as an archetypical warrior and a man of steel. After an incident in which he fired bullets over the heads of new conscripts during a training exercise, Chanel was transferred to the Mourmelon Army Base in the Marne region near Champagne. Chanel joined a parachuting club, and even after he was transferred, he still returned to Mourmelon every weekend to skydive. He would sleep in his camper van at night before returning the next day to the army base. In Chanel's van, there was a foam mattress from which investigators recovered over 400 hair samples. They found 32 pairs of men's underwear in various sizes stashed inside. None of them the standard army regulation white pairs he would have been issued with. When questioned about this, Chanel claimed he wore different pairs depending on his activity for the day. Smaller pairs were for running and larger ones for parachuting. The van also contained dumbbells, ropes, chains, knives, a vibrator, a video camera and tapes. As they looked into his background, they found former conscripts who had served under him describe a man who was harsh, intimidating and feared. Witnesses said he would sometimes call soldiers back to carry out menial tasks once others had gone, leaving them alone with him. In one reported incident, Chanel deliberately spilled water so that a recruit had to stay behind and clean up. That recruit disappeared shortly afterwards. Police discovered that each of the missing conscripts could be connected to Chanel in some way. When they examined records from the barracks, their suspicions grew. There were registers Chanel was required to sign daily. In the cases of 6 missing conscripts, his signature was absent on or around the days they disappeared. In 1990, Pierre Chanel stood trial for the kidnapping, rape and torture of the Hungarian hitchhiker Palaz Falvey, found in the back of his van. Unlike the disappearances at Mourmelon, this crime had a living victim. There was no ambiguity about what had happened in the back of the van. The jury convicted him. News of this conviction and the possible connection to Trevor O'Keeffe had begun to filter out from France to Ireland. Reports referred to Chanel as a Rambo sadist. Eirlín followed the media reporting closely as the information coming from the police was meagre. She had no official confirmation that they were investigating Chanel for Trevor's murder. Eirlín knew she would have to go to France herself to get answers. She made multiple trips, funded by small home improvement loans from her credit union. She spoke to witnesses herself. She revisited the spot where Trevor's body was found. She pushed officials for progress. She pleaded with them to let her see the contents of Chanel's van or barracks to check if there was anything of Trevor's there. She compiled lists of what her son had brought with him. She asked to see her son's belongings. She would scrape the money together to fly or ferry to Paris with her sister Nolene and then plead with the magistrates and police for updates before returning home to earn more and do it again. The French investigators, however, offered nothing but frustration. In December 1991, 4 years after Trevor's murder, a letter written in French arrived to Eirlín's home in Nice. It was from Judge Charles Marion, the magistrate over her son's case. She had not been expecting to hear from him and rushed to find a translator. Eirlín was shocked to learn that samples taken from a spade found in Chanel's van matched to soil samples from Trevor's body. Chanel was now the main suspect for her son's murder. This was the news Eirlín had been waiting to hear. But, the letter continued, there was not enough evidence to charge Chanel with Trevor's murder. Eirlín was devastated. She read the letter again and again, hoping that she had missed something. She had not. There was to be no trial, no justice. Eirlín could not accept that. In the years that followed, she kept fighting. She went back and forth to France, doing her best to navigate a foreign legal system while carrying the grief of losing her son. The fight for answers became something she had to manage alongside travel, paperwork, and long periods of silence. They didn't want to know us, Eirlín's sister Nolene said of the French officials. We'd go to the Justice Ministry in Paris and they'd literally tell us to go home. During his trial for the abduction and rape of Falvey, Chanel claimed he had been in relationships with 2 women. One of those women, he said, had been a girlfriend, though he insisted the relationship was not sexual. In 1992, while Chanel was already in prison, a woman who said she had been his girlfriend came forward to police. She was married by then and had children, but had previously worked as a barwoman in a pub in Mourmelon, frequented by soldiers. She told investigators she had seen Chanel around 30 times between September 1984 and August 1987. She described several encounters that, in hindsight, deeply unsettled her. On one occasion, she said Chanel arrived visibly distressed, sweating and shaking, and asked to be left alone, telling her he had done something stupid. On another occasion, she said she confronted him directly about the disappearances in Mormelon. She asked, was he involved? According to her statement, he replied calmly that the authorities would have to prove it. The woman alleged that in early summer 1987, while they were having a coffee together, Chanel told her that he was responsible for the first 3 men who had disappeared in Mormelon. She said that when she asked why he was telling her this, he replied that he trusted her. When she asked whether he feared being caught, she said he told her that it would be up to the justice system to prove it. She stated that one of the last times she saw him was in August 1987, around the same time Trevor went missing. She claimed that she asked him directly about his victims and that he described targeting young men who were hitchhiking alone, gaining their confidence through conversation, overpowering them when they resisted, restraining them, and killing them. Chanel's legal team argued that the statement was unreliable and inadmissible, pointing out that it was made years after the alleged events and relied entirely on the recollection of a single witness. For the families of the missing, it offered the possibility of answers, but no certainty. Much of what she claimed could neither be fully corroborated or conclusively dismissed. Earlene reshaped her life around her campaign for justice. She began driving a taxi. The flexibility of the work allowed her to earn money while still being able to travel to France when she needed to. Hunting justice, she had quickly learned, was expensive business. Later, she opened her own driving school in Nice, another way to fund the fight. This was the early 1990s. There was no email, no online translation, no instant access to information. Every letter from France had to be translated by hand, slowly and often at a cost. Understanding the correspondence from French authorities became a struggle in itself. Earlene did whatever she could. At one point, she even swapped driving lessons for help with translations, working with a newly qualified French teacher in Kildare to decode the documents that she had received. It was a constant drain on time, money and energy, all spent simply to keep the case alive. She and Nolene would spend hours with their notebooks out, planning the questions they would ask if they got the chance to meet with the magistrate. Questions about how Trevor died. Had he been sexually assaulted? What evidence was found at the scene? But for years, the answers remained out of reach. Then at last, several years later, Judge Marianne agreed to meet with Earlene. On Monday, the 25th of October 1994, shortly before 2 p.m, she stepped into his chambers, along with her sister Nolene and a translator from the Irish Embassy. Judge Marianne was welcoming and polite, with a charming smile, but he had few answers for their questions. He was categorical. Trevor had not been sexually assaulted. There was nothing belonging to Trevor found in Chanel's van. He had been strangled with piano wire. Earlene was beginning to get frustrated. She had seen the photographs herself and knew that Trevor's bruises could not have come from piano wire and were much more likely the result of a thick strap like the one Chanel had used on Falvey. Nolene prodded her with a pen, urging her to keep going. She asked to see Trevor's rucksack. It was not possible, the judge told her. It was 80 kilometres away, in a different district entirely. It would take days or even weeks to retrieve it. Earlene told him she would wait as long as it took. The smile dropped from Judge Marianne's face as he stood up. He walked over to a door, opened it, and pulled a rucksack out. Throwing it at her feet, he asked, "Is that it?" Not for the first time, Earlene was struck by the unwillingness of the justice system to cooperate. She suspected a cover-up to protect the military's reputation. Chanal's known victims included multiple army conscripts under his command, and it was clear that early on the army had closed ranks, dismissing missing soldiers as deserters rather than investigating the pattern of disappearances. Not long after Chanal had been convicted, the army burned whatever possessions had been left in his former living quarters. Earlene did not know who to trust or what steps to take. A journalist, Dominique Rizet, who had been following the case closely, reached out to her for an interview. Previously, she had avoided the media, afraid that journalists would twist the truth about her son. But this was different. Dominique was up front with her and had clearly done his research into the case. He showed Earlene a detailed file he had compiled on her son. It included information Earlene had been unaware of, like how the police had questioned Chanal about her son's murder, all the way back in 1988 when he was first arrested. Shocked by her lack of knowledge, the journalist put her in touch with a lawyer he knew, Eric Dupont-Moretti. Eric Dupont-Moretti was one of the top lawyers in France, and he was selective in the cases he took on. He came to Ireland to meet the two sisters. Dominique agreed to act as a translator, although his English was nowhere near fluent. For Earlene, getting the words out in any language was a struggle. She had never told anyone the full story of what happened to Trevor. Pushing down the lump in her throat, Earlene described the phone call from Tootsie and the agony of waiting for confirmation that it was Trevor. Eric let out a roar when he heard about the first trip to France when the family learned that Trevor had already been buried. They sat up all night as Earlene told of her horror at the realisation that her son had been murdered, and the years left frustrated by half-hearted investigations that followed. Eric agreed to take on her case. Earlene went to sleep that night with a sense of hope. Eric encouraged Earlene to make her fight for justice more public. As he toiled away with legal challenges, she began to accept more requests for interviews and met with the parents of other disappeared young men who had formed a group fighting for justice. The publicity campaign worked. Within weeks of Eric taking on the case, Chanal was charged with Trevor's murder. For the first time since 1987, Earlene could see the road ahead of her. After 6 years in the dark, Earlene would now receive the full case file on her son's murder. What she read in that file was enlightening, distressing and frustrating. It detailed Trevor's last movements. His friend Christian's mother had dropped him to the motorway after he refused her offer to cover his train fare. He had £30 on him, money Tootsie had given him for an emergency, so he could have covered the cost himself if he'd wanted to, but he preferred to hitchhike. Christian had been taken in for questioning in the initial stages of the investigation, but was quickly released. Earlene also had access to the autopsy report. It told her that her son's last meal was a burger and chips. She wondered if he'd eaten alone or if Chanal had fed him. Judge Marianne had insisted that Trevor had not been sexually assaulted, but the initial autopsy showed that no such investigation ever took place, despite the strangulation and ripped clothing, which suggested a potential sex crime. Soil and other samples taken from Trevor's nails and clothes during the autopsy had been sent for analysis, but the forensic report, which took 10 months to compile, was not signed, and the terms used were vague and unspecific. Not what would be expected from a typical forensic report. The original soil samples were then mislaid, so no further tests could be arranged. Police had found a cloth handkerchief beside Trevor's body. It bore Chanal's initials. Police had dismissed this as they were the same initials as a nearby institution. There were brown stains on the handkerchief that were never tested. No haematologist was involved in testing any blood samples. There was a note in the file about a series of checks Chanal had used to pay for petrol around the time of Trevor's murder. On the back, Chanal had noted the mileage he had travelled. Together, they could have been used to piece together Chanal's itinerary at the time. The checks, however, had gone missing. Police never followed up on the witness who had seen a green van near where Trevor's body was discovered. Over 400 hairs were recovered from a mattress in Chanel's van, but they sat untested as the judge deemed them unsuitable for analysis. They were then reported to be misplaced. Eric felt that the strongest evidence against Chanel was the similarities with the Falvey case, where Chanel's victim had lived to tell his story. The straps Chanel had used on Falvey could be a match to the strangulation marks on Trevor. Eric wanted them reinvestigated during Trevor's trial. While Chanel had been charged with Trevor's murder, under French law there would be no trial if the evidence was not deemed sufficient by the magistrate. Linking Trevor's case to a proven conviction would strengthen their case significantly, but crucially, they could only argue this point if Chanel remained in prison. On the 31st of January 1995, Chanel requested an early release. Eric and Erlene had just 10 days to lodge a counter-appeal. Eric began proceedings. He posted documents to Ireland for Erlene to sign and she sent them back. Any minor delay and they would miss their chance. Chanel would walk free. Erlene and Nolene flew to France for the court appearance. They hired a car for the hour-long drive from Paris to Amiens, where the trial would take place. Amiens is a major city in the region and is known as the Venice of the North due to the number of canals. Upon arrival, the sisters found themselves confused by the one-way system and they pulled over to ask the postman for directions to the courthouse. To their surprise, he opened the back door of the car, put his bag in, and then told Nolene to move out of the driver's seat. He drove them to the courthouse, and then to the hotel so they knew the way. The courthouse was not a grand room with a large open gallery full of spectators. Instead, it was a small room, just big enough for the group, which included 3 judges, a stenographer, the lawyers, some armed police, Erlene, Nolene, and Chanel. This was the first time Erlene had seen Pierre Chanel in person. He was sickly looking, gaunt with large eyes. He was not nearly as powerful looking as she had imagined him, sitting there in his blue tracksuit. He was recovering from a suicide attempt the day before the appeal began. Coming face to face with her son's killer, Erlene was determined that she would appear well informed. However, the £35 an hour fee for an interpreter would be too much for her already tight budget. Instead, she hatched a plan. Every time anyone spoke, Eric would lean over and pretend to whisper in her ear. Erlene would nod sagely or grimace depending on his body language, and to anyone else in the room it would seem she was sure of what was going on. The arguments went on for 4 hours. Erlene was never sure who was winning. Eric was good, but so too was Chanel's lawyer, a sophisticated Parisian who had an office along the Champs-Élysées. The time for deliberations came. Nolene and Erlene waited in the corridor, unconvinced that their efforts had been enough. Then the judges announced their decision. Chanel would stay in jail. They would have more time to put their case together. The 2 sisters were jubilant as they left the court and headed back to Ireland. They would get their trial. Just 2 months later, Chanel lodged another appeal. The rush to sign papers and to get to France was on again. This time, Erlene noted how much healthier and stronger Chanel looked. He's being looked after, she thought. Again, the 2 lawyers battled it out. Chanel lost his appeal. As he left the court that day, he stopped next to Erlene. "Madame O'Keeffe," he said, "je suis innocent." Erlene felt a chill course through her body as she looked in his eyes. She said nothing, stood, and left the room. After Chanel's 3rd failed appeal, Erlene met again with Judge Marianne. She was finally being allowed to view some of Chanel's belongings. A plastic bag was brought before her, and inside it were the 32 pairs of underpants they had found in Chanel's possession. Each in its own smaller plastic bag with a red seal. Among them were a white pair with a red stripe. They were from Marks and Spencer's. Earlene remembered buying them for Trevor before he left. Trevor had been found wearing a French brand of underwear in the wrong size. As Earlene left that meeting, more convinced than ever that Chantal had murdered her son, Judge Marianne made a promise to her. Chantal would never be released early. He would serve his time. Just a month later, she received word from the French embassy in Dublin that there was a document waiting there for her. She made an appointment for a few days' time. When she arrived, she was handed a letter. It was from Judge Marianne, the sort of letter that was usually sent directly to Eric Dupont-Moretti. Chantal had made another appeal. Earlene rang Eric straight away to let him know. He could do nothing until he had the letter from Earlene, so she signed it and sent it by registered post. It didn't arrive for a week. It was too late. Chantal was released from prison on the 19th of June 1995. He served only about 6.5 years of his 10-year term. Earlene was disgusted. The judge had promised her that Chantal would serve every day of his sentence, yet he walked out of prison early. For Chantal's victims and their families, it felt like betrayal upon betrayal by the system. Earlene couldn't handle the news reports of Chantal now free to continue on with his life. His army pension had been restored. He had skirted around restrictions on him driving by purchasing a battery-powered car. One report even had him teaching parachuting to a 100-year-old woman. Earlene laughed out loud when she read it. But laughter masked fury. She could not understand how he'd been let out. If he wasn't going to be behind bars, she wanted him dead. She bought a gun. Only her sister Nolene could talk any sense into her, reminding her, "You can't do this to your children. It would not serve any purpose." Instead, the sisters started a petition and arranged meetings with politicians, including government ministers. Earlene called Eric's office so often that the staff learned to say in English, "No news, Earlene." They lodged a formal complaint against Judge Marianne, and he was moved to a different court. In 1996, a new judge, Pascal Chapart, was appointed to Trevor O'Keeffe's case, the seventh magistrate to handle it, but the first in a while to show real determination. Chapart ordered the retrieval from storage of the forensic evidence from Chantal's van. If there wasn't enough evidence back in 1990 to put Chantal before the court for Trevor's murder, this new prosecutor would do all in his power to find it. He managed to locate the hair strands that had been collected back in 1988, retrieving not only the ones thought lost forever, but a further 200 strands. There were now upwards of 600 hair samples that could be tested. It seemed the long-awaited breakthrough Earlene hoped and prayed for might finally come. Forensic science had come a long way. DNA profiling technology had improved, and any evidence that had long sat idle was finally to be re-examined. For most of Earlene's fight for justice, it had been her sister Nolene by her side. She never let her children come with her to France. She couldn't bear for them to know the awful details of how Trevor had died. She knew they were already heartbroken, and that she could never fix that. She didn't want to add to their trauma. But now, the new judge was asking for DNA samples. So, for the first time, they all went together to the French police station. The police station was crowded. The families of the other disappeared. 30 or 40 people lined up to give their blood sample before filing into a room with rows of seats facing a television. Beside the television stood Judge Chapart, who addressed the crowd. The police officer assigned to translate only pretended to speak English to the O'Keeffes, who stood bewildered as the lights dimmed. Photographs began to appear on the screen. Pictures of tourists with cameras around their necks. Then shots of a helicopter. Then a video of a parachute jump. The O'Keeffes were confused as to why they were being shown these seemingly random camcorder videos. Suddenly the video switched. A young man appeared on the screen. He was naked and his feet were chained. When he moved, the noise of the chains that tied him to the camp bed rattled. Erlene realised this was one of the tapes Chanel had made of the victims he abducted and abused. The video moved on to a shot of Chanel masturbating. The abuse continued on the screen for an hour as the families grew more and more upset and nauseated at what they were being shown. When the lights switched back on, the French families were viscerally angry, crying and shouting at Judge Shepard as he ran from the room. Trevor's siblings could not believe what they had seen. They were furious, not just with the judge, but also with Erlene for keeping the truth of the case from them. "How could you keep this from us?" they screamed at her. "How could you not tell us what really happened to Trevor? What this monster did to him?" The next day, the tensions between them had not lifted, but still the O'Keeffe family hugged each other goodbye. The advanced DNA tests on the 600 hairs found in Chanel's Volkswagen camper revealed a very strong probability that hairs from at least 3 different victims were present, and one of those profiles matched Trevor O'Keeffe. Soil samples from a shovel found in the van, previously thought lost, were again tested and found to match the unique soil at Trevor's burial site. After nearly 15 years, the French judiciary finally acted on the mounting evidence. In 2002, Judge Shepard formally charged Pierre Chanel with the murders of 3 young men, Trevor O'Keeffe and 2 missing French soldiers, Patrice Denis and Patrick Goche. For Erlene and the O'Keeffe family, it felt like a vindication of the tireless campaign. But they wouldn't get too excited. Justice was far from served, but thanks to Erlene's persistence, what French media had dubbed the Mormelon disappearances case was at last heading to a courtroom. For years after his murder, Erlene would sleep with Trevor's pyjamas underneath her pillow, hoping one morning she might wake up and he would be there. She would put dinner on for him and wash his clothes as if he'd worn them during the week. Trevor's family carried the grief in their own way. His brother James held onto a feeling of guilt for years. He had rejected Trevor's request to stay with him in London that summer and felt responsible for his decision to go to France. Now, it appeared it was only a matter of time before the person who was responsible would face justice. But Chanel had made it clear that he would rather die than go back to jail. The story had another sickening twist in store. On the 14th anniversary of Trevor's death in 2001, Pierre Chanel was brought before the courts in Reims and charged with his murder, along with the murder of the 2 other missing men, Patrick Goche and Patrice Denis. The families knew that it would take time before the case was put together, and as the evidence mounted, so did their hope that they would finally see Chanel convicted. It was a cautious hope. Chanel had already attempted to commit suicide once in 1994, and there was a growing fear that he might try again. Finally, a date was set. The trial would take place on the 12th of May 2003. Erlene received the news with a mixture of emotions. The trial she had fought so hard for was finally going to take place. But it was on the day of her daughter's wedding. Erlene would have to miss the special day. Heartbroken, she knew what her decision would be. She was going back to France. She was determined to sit in the courtroom and see the man she believed killed her son finally answer for his crimes. 2 days before proceedings were about to get underway, Chanel was taken to hospital following what was described as a drug overdose. Erlene and Nolene walked the streets before sitting down in the town cathedral, lighting candles for his recovery. She noted the irony she felt. As they sat there waiting for an update on the trial, a wedding party arrived. Erlene thought of her own daughter getting married miles away. Soon after, the trial was postponed until October. That summer, Chanel went on hunger strike. It lasted for 3 months. By the time the trial finally opened on the 14th of October 2003, Chanel was under police guard in the university hospital in Reims. The courtroom was larger than the families expected. 5 judges sat on the bench. The jury was sworn in. Rows of seats were reserved for the families of the victims. Interpreters translated every word as it was spoken. There was a notable empty seat in the room. Chanel's hunger strike had left him unfit to attend court in person. There was a chance that the whole trial could fall apart without him there. Chanel might get what he wanted. The justice that the families had fought so long for was slowly starting to slip away. Hope began to fade. Then Eroline's lawyer made an unprecedented request. He wanted them to try Chanel in absentia. A gasp went around the room as he finished his argument. André Bouffard, the stout and soft-spoken lawyer representing Chanel, began to shout. His client had a right to a fair trial. The judges retired to their chambers to deliberate the most unusual request. Inside the courtroom, the victims' families held their breath. The seconds ticked away. Eventually, the judges filed back in. They had made their decision. Next to Eroline, the interpreter stood quickly, translating the ruling into English. The trial would go ahead without Chanel. Once he was stable enough, he would be brought in. The relief in the room was tangible. By the time the trial finally began, nearly 2 decades had passed. For the families, it felt surreal. After years of appeals and delays, they were walking back into a courtroom, not knowing if the moment would hold, or collapse like so many before it. New DNA evidence linked Pierre Chanel to the murder of Trevor O'Keeffe and to the 2 other victims. For the first time, there was real hope that justice might finally be done. The trial drew international attention. A former French army officer, decorated for distinguished service, now accused of being one of France's most prolific and brutal serial killers. And among the dead, a young Irish hitchhiker whose mother has refused to let his case disappear. Pierre Chanel was not in the courtroom. He was in hospital. Proceedings began in his absence. The first day was slow and procedural. Charges were outlined. The scope of the trial was set. Then the prosecution began to present its case. Early evidence focused on Pierre Chanel's habits and routines. Former colleagues from his army service were called as witnesses, men who had known him well in the mid-80s. They described him as meticulous, obsessive about cleanliness, particular about hygiene and order. They spoke about how often he shaved and how carefully he maintained his living space. Then the court turned to the mattress that the investigators had recovered from his van during the investigation. Forensic examination showed that it contained hairs belonging to several of the victims. When questioned about this, Chanel had said he had found the mattress abandoned at the side of the road. He had picked it up and used it to sleep on. He denied any connection between the mattress and the victims. He maintained that the hairs must already have been there when he found it. Witnesses were then asked whether this account aligned with the man they knew. They said it did not. They told the judges that Chanel was exceptionally clean, that he was uncomfortable with dirt, that he would not, in their view, collect a discarded mattress from the roadside and sleep on it, even if he claimed to have cleaned it. The contradiction was clear. The prosecution didn't need to dramatise it. The first day of evidence lasted 14 hours. By the time proceedings ended, it was dark outside. The courthouse emptied. The families stepped out exhausted, but with a sense that something important had started. Eroline's only regret that day was that Chanel had not been there to see his case begin to crumble. That evening, his lawyer, André Bouffard, went to visit Chanel to give him a rundown of the opening day. He was with him for 10 minutes. He would later say, "I found him very weak. He gave me the impression that he was no longer concerned with what was happening. He seemed relatively serene." That same evening, the victims' families went out for dinner together, toasting to a successful first day. The O'Keeffes were staying in the apartment of an Irish woman they had met by chance one day at the train station. She was aware of the case, and had offered up her home near the court to the family. Chanel had other visitors to his cell that night besides his lawyer. At 10:20 p.m, a nurse passed by the room to check that everything was all right. Then, from 10:25 p.m. to 10:50 p.m, a bailiff and 2 court clerks came to read him the minutes of the day's hearing. At 12:25 a.m, a nurse came again to take his blood pressure. There was a change in shift for the police doing the night watch at 12:30 a.m, with nothing unusual noted. At 12:38 a.m, a newly posted police officer noticed that Pierre Chanel's head had fallen backwards on the pillow. Something was wrong. He called the on-duty doctor, who arrived in the room a minute and a half later. The O'Keeffes had not given their phone number to anyone except one journalist, Lara Marlowe. In the middle of the night, Earlene was woken by the sound of the telephone. Her sister answered the call. Earlene could hear Lara's voice on the other end. Chanel was dead. The sisters collapsed to the floor, crying. Chanel had used a technique called the commando method taught in the army to take his own life. Despite being under constant supervision, he managed to access a razor blade and slice through a major artery. He had hidden the blade between his dentures and his palate. The 4 police officers stationed outside his hospital room were observing him through a glass screen. Chanel covered himself with a blanket, hiding the injuries from view. Once the guards realised something was wrong, Chanel had already lost massive amounts of blood. By the time the alarm was raised, it was too late. Pierre Chanel bled to death in 4 minutes in his hospital bed. At 12:47 a.m. on the 15th of October 2003, Pierre Chanel was pronounced dead, just 7 hours before the second day of his trial. Pierre Chanel, the accused serial killer, was dead at age 56, by his own hand and on his own terms. Having spent years evading justice, he had finally escaped. The trial, which had only just begun, was over before the start of the second day. Under French law, the case against Chanel had to be closed without a verdict due to the defendant's death. Legally speaking, Chanel died an innocent man. In the span of minutes, 23 years of questions were left dangling with no resolution. The next day, the presiding judge formally declared the proceedings at an end, the charges extinguished by Chanel's demise. For the families of the victims, it was an unbearable anticlimax. They would never hear a jury declare Chanel guilty. Worse, for 6 of the 8 known families, they would likely never learn where their loved ones' bodies were hidden. Only 2 victims, Trevor and one of the French conscripts, had ever been found. The French interpreter for the O'Keeffes, Nicole Cohn, spoke of Earlene's distress at the news, saying Earlene had nothing to say. There was only sadness in her eyes. Now she is mourning again. She had waited for such a long time for this. The trial had finally started. It was the beginning of the end. Now it is the end. Gilles Denis, who had lost his brother, 20-year-old Patrice Denis, in 1985, put it starkly. Chanel's suicide is the crowning glory of a case that has been a masquerade, a catastrophe for French justice. Day 2 of the trial was when Earlene O'Keeffe was due to give evidence. Instead, she was comforting her distraught children. They had lost their brother, and now they had been robbed of justice. Lara Marlowe, that Irish Times journalist who Earlene had given her number to, covered Earlene's story for many years. She would later recall that, despite the many setbacks and moments of heartbreak, she never once saw Earlene weep. She would say Earlene had a powerful sense of dignity throughout it all. Before leaving the court after the final judgment, Earlene caught the eye of Pallas Falve, the Hungarian hitchhiker who was abducted, raped and tortured by Chanel. He had survived the horrific ordeal and was in court hoping that the other victims who were not as lucky would get some measure of justice. Palaz walked over. He was slight, dark-haired, calm. He wore glasses. He carried himself with a quiet stillness. He did not say much, only that he was glad it was over. That Chanel was dead. His voice was soft, but measured. He looked around the room at the families who had waited so long, looked directly at Erilyn and said, "Go home, Madame O'Keeffe. It is better this man is dead. He is in the best place. He should not be on this earth. There are worse things than death." In January 2005, Erilyn O'Keeffe finally won a case against the French state. The court ruled that Trevor's investigation had been mishandled. The judgment formally acknowledged that the justice system had failed her son. The ruling did not name Pierre Chanel as Trevor's killer. Instead, it placed responsibility on the system itself. The court awarded Erilyn compensation of around €25,000 for serious failings in the investigation. The cheque from the French government was minor in comparison to what she had spent over the years, flying back and forth fighting for justice. But it was an admission, even if it came 17 and a half years after Trevor was killed. For Erilyn, it changed very little. The questions that mattered most were still unanswered, and even after that ruling, she was not finished. Her legal team announced a further case, this time challenging the French authorities over the circumstances that allowed a high-profile prisoner under 24-hour watch to commit suicide. The French Justice Minister launched an inquiry into the security lapse. But that was little solace to the families, who felt justice had been stolen from them at the 11th hour. What her fight did achieve was exposure. Chanel's crimes were no longer dismissed or minimised. Erilyn later wrote about that fight in her book, Fatal Journey. It became an important source for our own research into this case. In its pages, she documents the practical cost of grief, the years of uncertainty, and the physical weight of living with unanswered questions. She also writes about learning how to live with loss, not move past it. Trevor O'Keeffe is buried in Naas, County Kildare. He was 19 years old when he was killed. He would be 57 now. His life ended on a roadside in France, but his mother fought to keep his legacy alive. Trevor did not get justice in a courtroom. There was no verdict, no moment of legal closure. What there was instead was a record. Evidence gathered, lost, recovered. Failures acknowledged. A system forced eventually to admit it had gone wrong. That record exists because Trevor's mother refused to stop asking questions, because she kept going when the case stalled, when evidence vanished, when the doors closed. Erilyn was supported by her sister, Nolene Slattery, who stood beside her every step of the way, travelling with her, translating documents, sitting through court hearings, sharing the weight of a fight that should never have fallen on one family. What remains is Trevor's name and the truth about what happened to him, not because justice worked as it should have, but because his family made sure his name wouldn't be forgotten. Pierre Chanel died without a verdict. The trial ended without judgment, without answers, without the acknowledgement the families had waited for. But this story is not his. It belongs to the young men who never came home. Patrick Dubois, Serge Havel, Manuel Carvalho, Pascal Sargent, Olivier Donner, Patrick Gash, Trevor O'Keeffe, and Tupalas Falve, who survived. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lines of Enquiry. We have set up an Instagram page. If you're there, please give us a follow at Lines of Enquiry Podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, leaving a rating or review really helps. We've now nearly 3,000 5-star ratings on Spotify, with a growing number of reviews on Apple Podcasts. Those responses really make a difference. They help new listeners find the series. We read every comment, and we're genuinely grateful for the time you take to share your thoughts. If you like the podcast and would like to see a live show, please fill out the survey in the episode description. You can also get in touch with us directly by emailing linesofenquiry@goloudnow.com if you have a question or want to share a case with us you'd like us to cover. Lines of Enquiry is presented by me, John Sweetman. The podcast is created by Darren Cleary. Our executive producer is Owen Brennan. Siobhan Walsh and Siobhan Maguire are our producers. This episode was written by Darren Cleary and edited by Siobhan Walsh. Sound design and editing by Neil Kavanagh. Legal, marketing and social media support comes from the team at GoLoud. If you would like to support the series, we'd really appreciate it. Please share it with a friend on WhatsApp, post it to your story on Instagram and tag @Lines of Enquiry Podcast, or simply recommend it to someone you know. It makes a real difference. Join me next time as we open another case and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Because, in the end, everything done in the dark comes to light.